The last thing I expected that Tuesday morning was to hear blood-curdling screams echoing through the canyon, followed by my alpaca Bolt trotting proudly back toward the barn with a ripped designer handbag hanging from his mouth like a trophy. I barely had time to set down my coffee before Spitfire, my second guard alpaca, galloped in behind him, his woolly coat splattered with what looked like mascara and fake tan lotion. And then came the shout that really made me choke on my sip, Karen's unmistakable voice screeching from the other side of the pasture, yelling about assault and threatening lawsuits, all while dragging her flip-flop across the grass and cradling her trembling Pomeranian. That's when I knew something had gone down. And if I've learned one thing living out here on this dusty stretch of ranch land, it's that when my alpacas get involved, justice comes dressed in wool and fury. But let's rewind just a bit, because this story didn't start with screams. It started with scissors. When I bought the ranch 4 years ago, all I wanted was a quiet slice of earth where I could live on my own terms, raise a few animals, and drink my morning coffee without someone honking behind me in traffic. The land was tucked between 2 hills, with wide skies, clean air, and a fence line I built with my own hand. My neighbors were decent folks who kept to themselves, until 2 months ago when Karen moved in with her husband Doug, their yappy dog Princess, and an attitude so thick it could block Wi-Fi. Her mansion sat on the ridge overlooking my back pasture, a gleaming beacon of entitled suburban luxury with a lawn that looked vacuumed and an American flag the size of a parachute. The first time we met, she wasn't offering cookies. She was demanding that I do something about the smell of my compost pile, compost that was 50 yards from her house and downwind. At first, I figured she was just adjusting to country life. That maybe, just maybe, a few interactions with the locals would mellow her out. But no, Karen wasn't adjusting. She was invading. She complained about my rooster's early crowing. She complained that my tractor was too loud. She even marched up to my barn one afternoon to yell at me for hanging laundry on a line instead of using a dryer like normal people. But the real turning point came on a sunny Friday morning when I noticed a clean, deliberate cut in my back fence. At first, I thought maybe a coyote had done it or one of the calves got rowdy. But when I checked the security footage from my barn cam, I couldn't believe my eyes. There she was, in high definition, wearing yoga pants and a floppy sun hat, marching across my pasture like she owned it. She stopped right at the fence, looked around casually, and pulled out a pair of garden shears. Snip, snip, snip. She cut a doorway-sized hole, stepped through, and walked right into my ranch like it was a public park. Her tiny dog waddled behind her, leash dragging, and she didn't even flinch when she looked straight into the camera and waved. That night, I reinforced the opening with a temporary wooden barricade, more out of hope than belief it would stop her. But I knew, deep down, Karen wasn't done. The thing Karen didn't know, though, is that my alpacas aren't ordinary alpacas. Bolt and Spitfire are trained livestock guardians, and while they're usually gentle with people they know, they don't take kindly to trespassers. Especially ones who cut fences. I had trained them myself using scent markers, vocal cues, and mock drills. If someone unfamiliar entered the pasture, they wouldn't attack, but they would intercept. And if that person ran or screamed, well, let's just say they were trained to treat that like a coyote trying to flee with a chicken in its mouth. The next day, just as I suspected, Karen returned. This time, she wasn't wearing yoga pants. She was dressed like she was going to a resort, floppy hat, oversized sunglasses, white tracksuit, and Crocs with fake diamonds on them. She stepped through the makeshift hole I had just blocked and kicked aside the wood like it offended her existence. Bolt spotted her first. His ears perked and he made a low humming noise. Spitfire responded with a grunt. I leaned against the barn door, coffee in hand, and watched as the two of them began their slow approach. Karen didn't notice them until they were 10 feet away. Her dog barked, and instead of turning back, she shouted something at Bolt, like she was commanding him. Big mistake. Bolt charged. Not a full-speed sprint, but that deliberate kind of jog that says, "I'm not kidding." Karen screamed, turned, tripped, and face-planted into the wildflowers. Spitfire lunged forward and yanked the handbag off her shoulder, swinging it like a toy. The Pomeranian ran in circles, and Karen was flailing on the ground, yelling something about animal cruelty. I just stood there, dumbfounded and amused, watching the world's weirdest standoff unfold in my backyard. Eventually, Karen crawled back through the fence, shrieking and sobbing, with grass in her hair and mud on her pants. Bolt dropped the handbag in the mud like it was a dead possum. Spitfire snorted and trotted back toward the barn with all the swagger of a bouncer who just tossed out a rowdy drunk. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. She saw me standing there and glared like I'd committed some crime. I simply raised my coffee and gave her a friendly little nod. By that evening, she had already posted a rant on the neighborhood Facebook group, claiming she was attacked by wild llamas while peacefully walking her support animal. The comments roasted her to no end. Someone pointed out that llamas and alpacas aren't the same. Another said, "Maybe don't walk through a fence you cut yourself, Karen." My favorite reply was a gif of a spitting llama with the caption, "Boom. Headshot." She deleted the post, but screenshots were already circulating. Her attempt at pity had turned into a meme. That was just day one. I didn't know it then, but this fence-cutting incident wasn't the end. It was just the fuse. And my ranch? It was about to turn into the battleground for the strangest war of all time, a war where the soldiers wore wool, the enemy wore Crocs, and victory smelled like alpaca breath and karma. The next morning the air was crisp and clear, with a hint of lavender drifting off the bushes by the fence line. I was halfway through repairing the section Karen had destroyed with her garden shears when I saw a county truck roll up my drive. Out stepped a uniformed animal control officer, clipboard in hand, sunglasses too large for his face. At first, I thought it might be something unrelated until he asked, in a dry voice, if this was the place with the aggressive feral llamas. I nearly choked on my laughter. I corrected him politely. Not llamas. Alpacas. And definitely not feral. He flipped through his clipboard and told me he had a complaint from a neighbor alleging that two dangerous animals had attacked her while she was walking her dog through a shared trail. That was the first twist of the day. I invited him over to the barn and offered a seat while I pulled up the camera footage from the previous morning. We watched together as Karen strutted into the pasture, ignored the posted "private property" sign, kicked through the temporary barrier, and entered like she was on her own estate. Then came the part where Bolt made his entrance, tail high, head focused. The officer's eyebrows arched higher with every second. Spitfire's grand snatch of the handbag was the cherry on top. When the footage ended, the officer leaned back, smirked, and muttered something about filing a counter-report for false claims. Apparently, this wasn't his first Karen call. He said she'd already been flagged for filing nuisance complaints in her last neighborhood too. Just when I thought it might end there, the officer added that while Bolt and Spitfire were technically not in violation of any ordinance, he did need to see their vaccination records and confirm they were registered livestock. I opened the binder I keep in the feed room, fully prepped for this moment. Bolt and Spitfire had been 4-H stars. They were registered, vaccinated, and even microchipped. The officer took photos of the paperwork and let out a laugh when he saw Spitfire's ID photo. "This one's got attitude," he said. I nodded. Spitfire definitely did. That evening, just before sunset, I heard another round of shrieking, but this time not from my pasture. Karen was on her front porch, yelling at a different county officer. This one from animal control again, but with a second clipboard and an entirely different purpose. Turns out, while the original officer was reviewing my camera footage, he spotted Karen's dog, Princess, off-leash and acting erratic. He ran the dog's registration and found no local license, no updated rabies shot, and no paperwork on record at all. Which, in this county, means fines and a mandatory check-in. The second officer was there to issue a notice and request Karen bring Princess in for an evaluation. The irony practically painted itself on the wall. Karen was red-faced and frantic, insisting her dog was a certified emotional support animal and therefore above the law. The officer calmly explained that emotional support animals still require health records, especially if they're allegedly involved in a pasture incident. Her face dropped. She glanced toward my property, saw me sitting on my porch swing sipping sweet tea, and I swear if looks could melt a fence, mine would have been a puddle of splinters. I didn't wave this time. I just raised my glass. The next few days were surprisingly quiet. No more fence damage, no more screams. But peace around here never lasts long when someone like Karen lives next door. Sure enough, I spotted her late one evening walking the edge of my property with a man in a neon yellow vest and a rolling blueprint tube under his arm. A contractor. They paced, pointed, and at one point Karen stomped her foot like she was throwing a tantrum. I had a bad feeling in my gut and decided to act before the storm hit. That night, I emailed the county zoning office and requested a review of any submitted development plans near my property line. It was a preemptive strike, something I learned to do when city folks try country tactics. 2 days later, I got the email that confirmed it all. Karen had submitted a trail pathway request, citing historical access and claiming that my land once included an easement from the 1940s. Her plan? To install a walking path, right through my pasture without my permission. The kicker? She'd submitted it under the name Community Wellness Project. I laughed so hard I spilled my coffee. She really thought she could yoga stretch her way across my property by calling it a health benefit. The county wasn't buying it. The records I sent in, showing my property purchase, fence installation, and livestock ownership, completely debunked her claims. But it wasn't over. No, Karen had one more trick in her sparkly crock. That weekend, a white pickup with magnetic signs pulled into her driveway. Out hopped 2 young men in tool belts, a wheelbarrow, and concrete mix. I watched as they rolled through the gate she'd cut and began laying out stakes. I confronted them politely and asked what they were building. One shrugged and said they were contracted to pour a foundation for a path. I told them firmly they were on private land and needed to pack up before I called the sheriff. That's when Bolt appeared again, right on cue, his shaggy neck puffed up like a lion's mane. Spitfire was close behind. The 2 contractors froze. Then the smell hit them. They'd been working directly in one of the Alpacas' favorite relief spots. Their boots were already caked in half-dried dung, and the wheelbarrow had tipped over onto a pile of it. They gagged. Bolt snorted. They left. Karen stormed down minutes later, yelling at me from the other side of the fence like I was the one trespassing. She accused me of sabotaging her wellness project and claimed she had a lawyer who would be all over this. I didn't say a word. I just pointed to the "No Trespassing" sign, then pointed to the camera mounted on my barn. She didn't have a comeback. Just more muttered threats as she dragged her garden hose across her yard like it was a sword. But Karen wasn't finished. That night, I spotted something odd glinting near the fence line. A little black dot with a blinking red light. I got closer and realized it was a cheap surveillance camera, duct-taped to the base of my old irrigation pipe, pointed directly at the pasture. Karen had set up a hidden camera on my land. This wasn't just petty now, it was creepy. I removed the device carefully, then followed the cable trail that led into a shallow trench she'd dug just outside the fence. She'd actually tried to bury the wire. That's when I decided it was time to flip the game on her. The next morning, I set up my own camera feed with a twist. I mounted a spare outdoor projector onto the side of my barn, aimed directly at the pasture. I rigged it to display a live loop of her trespassing and getting spit on by Bolt. Every night at sunset, for the next week, the scene played like a backyard drive-in movie. The locals started dropping by to watch. Some brought lawn chairs. One brought popcorn. Karen finally realized her camera had been found and yanked it out of the ground during one of her early morning tantrums. But the damage was done. She was now AL. 3 days of quiet passed, which around here usually meant someone was about to do something stupid. I kept working the fields, tending to the alpacas, and rebuilding the section of fence Karen had repeatedly violated, but there was always this strange tension in the air. Even the alpacas were twitchier than usual, especially Bolt, who would pause mid-chew and look toward the ridge like he was waiting for something. And then it happened. Just before sunrise on a Thursday, a rumble of tires echoed up the dirt road, and I looked out to see a flatbed truck loaded with gravel, 2 workers in neon vests, and, standing proudly next to them with a clipboard in hand, Karen. She was dressed like a forest ranger in a spotless tan jumpsuit, oversized hiking boots, and a whistle hanging around her neck like she was about to lead a kids' camp through the wood. She spotted me from across the pasture, gave me a smug little salute, and turned to instruct the crew to start laying gravel directly across the patch of land she'd already cut through. I walked over calmly, Bolt trailing behind me like a furry bodyguard. I didn't even have to say anything. The workers paused the moment they saw the alpaca. They weren't local and clearly hadn't heard the stories. Karen, on the other hand, was already raising her voice about community right-of-ways and citizen pathways, going off about how this was technically neutral land due to a historic claim filed with the original county surveyor. It was a mouthful of nonsense that sounded like it came from a YouTube conspiracy documentary. I asked her if she had a permit. She waved a stapled printout in the air and shouted that it was being processed, which is basically legal speak for absolutely not. That's when Bolt did what Bolt does best. He took one long step forward, dropped a steaming pile of alpaca protest directly on the edge of the gravel pile, and looked Karen dead in the eye. The workers immediately stopped unloading, whispered something about needing to call their supervisor, and within 10 minutes they were packing up. Karen screamed at them, waving her arms like she was trying to land a helicopter, but they drove off anyway. She turned back toward me with fury in her eyes, but I was already walking away, satisfied. I didn't need to argue. Bolt had spoken. That afternoon I filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board and attached updated footage of the attempted trail construction. I also forwarded everything to the HOA, just in case Karen had lied to them too. The very next day I received a call confirming that no permits had been filed by Karen or anyone connected to her address. In fact, her entire property sat just outside the HOA's official boundary, which meant she technically wasn't allowed to speak on their behalf either. The HOA president, a man named Earl who'd been quietly observing all of this from a distance, finally admitted over the phone that they were deeply concerned about Karen's behavior. Apparently she'd already ticked off half the neighborhood by demanding people install matching mailbox colors. And now, with my videos going semi-viral on the neighborhood app, she was becoming a liability. But Karen wasn't finished. If anything, she was escalating. The next morning, I discovered a new camera, this one buried deeper, disguised in a fake rock with a lens poking through. She was now trying to catch my animals, being aggressive, likely in a final attempt to get them labeled as dangerous. I took the rock camera and placed it directly in front of the chicken coop where the hens spend the morning pecking at feed like the peaceful little critters they are. Then I let Bolt walk over and sneeze on the lens. The footage must have been stunning. That night, things took an even weirder turn. Karen, perhaps realizing the legal route wasn't working, decided to try her hand at fake diplomacy. Around dusk, she showed up at my gate carrying a covered tray and wearing an apron that read, "Let's bake a truce." I kid you not. She handed me the tray and said she was trying to extend a peaceful olive branch. The look on her face was too sweet to be real. My first instinct was to toss the tray, but curiosity won. I took it inside, removed the lid, and found a dozen chocolate chip cookies, and a faint scent that didn't belong. I didn't eat them. I gave one to my neighbor's dog, who sniffed it and walked away like it had insulted his entire bloodline. A quick sniff told me why. They were laced with something, maybe CBD oil or a mild sedative. Not enough to knock out a person, but probably enough to dull an animal's senses. I bagged them, labeled the tray, and stored them in the barn fridge. Later, I found out she'd been bragging in a Facebook group about softening up the beasts. One of her so-called friends had screenshotted it and sent it to me. Karen was trying to drug my animals to get them to stop defending the property. That alone could have landed her with a misdemeanor for animal tampering, and I was getting real close to filing a full report. Instead, I decided to turn the tables with a little creativity. The next day, I updated the barn projector to show a slideshow of every time Karen had trespassed, zoomed in for dramatic effect. I added captions like Day 1, the scissors strike, and Day 4, gravel of deceit. Locals came by and watched, laughing from the tailgates of their trucks. One guy brought popcorn. Bolt stood proudly beside them like he was hosting a film premiere. Karen, meanwhile, slammed her blinds shut every time the slideshow began, which just made it even funnier. Every evening the crowd grew. At this point, Karen wasn't just infamous, she was a full-blown attraction. She tried calling the sheriff one evening to complain about targeted harassment through projection. When the deputy arrived and watched 10 seconds of her climbing through my fence and yelling at my livestock, he chuckled and said, "Ma'am, you did this to yourself." She stomped away without another word. She'd officially run out of allies. Even Doug, her mysteriously silent husband, had started parking down the street and walking home, probably hoping nobody would recognize his SUV. But then came her final move. The one that pushed everything past the line. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, Karen attempted to weld my alpaca gate shut. Yes, weld. I caught it all on camera. A portable arc welder, some gloves she clearly didn't know how to use, and sparks flying while she mumbled angrily to herself. The weld didn't even hold. The next morning, Bolt pushed the gate open with his forehead like it was made of pillows. But the evidence was more than enough. That was criminal property damage and endangerment of animals. I handed the footage over to the authorities, along with every other clip, screen capture, and cookie tray I'd saved. The sheriff called me personally 2 days later. Karen had been cited for trespassing, vandalism, filing a false report, and animal tampering. Her court date was set. The HOA was launching an emergency vote to remove her from any committee positions, citing neighborhood disruption. She'd gone from self-appointed trail queen to community outcast. And yet, somehow, I knew we hadn't reached the end of this saga. Karen had one last meltdown left in her. It was just a matter of time. There was a certain calm that came after the storm of Karen's late-night welding incident, but I knew better than to trust it. It wasn't real peace. It was the pause people take when they're thinking of what ridiculous thing to try next. Karen hadn't been seen for a few days. Her blinds stayed closed, her driveway was empty, and even Princess the Pomeranian hadn't been heard barking since that last ticket from animal control. But something in the air felt off, and even the alpacas were restless. Bolt paced more than usual, Spitfire refused to stay in the lower field, and the chickens had taken to huddling together under the coop roof like they sensed incoming chaos. It wasn't long before that hunch turned into something real. One morning, I received a bright orange envelope tucked inside my mailbox with "Urgent Municipal Notice" written across the front. Inside was a formal complaint alleging that I had violated zoning ordinances by hosting unauthorized public events on private land, specifically referencing the barn movie nights. Attached was a grainy screenshot of the projector slideshow I had been playing of Karen's antics. I stared at it for a solid minute, wondering who in their right mind would call that an event. Then I read the signature at the bottom. Filed by Karen O. Thompson. Of course. She was trying to get my property flagged for zoning violations. It was clever in a desperate kind of way. If I had no event permits and the land was being used for gatherings, she thought she could shut me down by choking the legal route. Unfortunately for her, I had anticipated something like this months ago when she first started sniffing around with fake claims. I had already spoken to the county office and obtained a preemptive special use permit that allowed for occasional community educational events, specifically ones related to livestock care. As long as I called the slideshow a livestock training session or rural awareness night, it was protected. I made a copy of the permit, highlighted the relevant section, and mailed it straight back to the zoning board with a polite note. Just for fun, that Friday's livestock training session was titled, Alpaca Defense Tactics and the Myth of the Community Trail. I set up extra chairs, invited the neighbors, and even handed out little pamphlets with Bolt's face on the front. Karen peeked through her blinds the entire time, and at one point she opened her window just enough to scream about noise violations, but nobody paid her any mind. The sheriff was already sitting on my porch, chuckling with a soda in hand and a bag of popcorn in his lap. Still, Karen wasn't finished. If she couldn't go through the county or the HOA, she was going to hit below the belt. I started receiving anonymous complaints filed through online reporting portals. Everything from animal neglect to operating a petting zoo without a license. Each one was clearly fake, and they all used the same kind of phrasing, words like unhygienic, aggressive, and threatening to community safety. But what she didn't realize was that most of those portals routed straight back to the sheriff's office or agricultural board, both of which already knew the situation in full detail. They came out once more for protocol's sake and left with nothing but a few eggs and a bag of alpaca wool for their trouble. One of the officers even asked if Spitfire could be rented out to scare away deer from his aunt's garden. I told him I'd think about it. But the best part was when the sheriff walked right up to Karen's property after the inspection and knocked on her door with a clipboard in hand. She opened it halfway and started shouting before he even said a word. I couldn't hear the whole exchange, but I saw her face twist and drop as he handed her a citation for misuse of public complaint services and a warning about filing fraudulent reports. She slammed the door so hard it rattled the front wreath off its hook. Now that her usual methods had failed, Karen went into full meltdown mode. She began pacing her yard every morning, shouting on the phone to someone I could only assume was her lawyer, or her third attempt at one, since the first two had already backed out. Then came the sign war. She installed a large wooden board right at the fence line that read, "Beware of vicious animals, community safety at risk." She even added a red strobe light and a motion sensor alarm that went off every time an alpaca got within 10 feet of it. So I responded in kind. I placed my own sign next to it, professionally printed and framed in rust-proof steel. It read, "Private property, trespassers will be spit on." Underneath, I added a photo of Bolt mid-spit, with his mouth wide open and the glob of foamy justice frozen midair. The locals loved it. People came by just to take selfies with the sign. A local t-shirt company offered to print shirts with Bolt's face and the words, "Spit happens," across the chest. I agreed. Proceeds would go toward building a new animal shelter just outside town. That's when I found out Karen was still holding a spot on the HOA advisory board as a community wellness liaison. That was all I needed to know. I contacted Earl, the HOA president, and sent him a packet. Inside were screenshots, complaint records, photos, and a timeline of everything that had happened since she moved in. I topped it off with video evidence of her trying to weld the gate shut. It was over 10 pages long, complete with a cover sheet titled, "Why Karen Must Go." Earl called me the next morning and said the board was holding a vote that afternoon. By sundown, she was officially removed from the board. Her only power had been stripped, and now she was just another angry neighbor with a grudge and no influence. To celebrate, I threw a wedding on the ranch. Not mine. My buddy Jack had been looking for a place to host his rustic outdoor ceremony, and I offered the pasture by the old sycamore tree. We set up string lights, brought in a food truck, and had a bluegrass band play into the evening. Bolt wore a little bow tie and stood proudly near the aisle, occasionally grunting during the vows like he was officiating. The guests were dancing, the stars were out, and everything was perfect, until Karen showed up. She stomped out of her house in slippers and a housecoat, phone in one hand, waving it like she was recording us. She shouted something about disturbing the peace, and how this was not a designated wedding venue. But the sheriff was already there. He walked over, calm as ever, and told her to either enjoy the cake or go back inside. She stood there for a moment, steam practically rising from her ears, then turned around and vanished into her house. The band played louder after that. Bolt sneezed. The night carried on. Later that week, I received a message from a local news reporter. Apparently, the story had made its way onto social media and was picking up traction. A post about Karen's fence cutting, the revenge of the Alpacas, and her now infamous meltdown was going viral. They wanted to run a segment on it. I agreed under one condition, that they highlight the ranch's animal rescue efforts and promote donations to the shelter. The news anchor laughed and said absolutely. It started with the sound of tires skidding across gravel. Not the kind of calm, cautious pull-in from a neighbor, but the screech of someone with something to prove. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and watched as a large SUV came to a crooked stop at the edge of Karen's driveway. She got out wearing full camo, of all things, with binoculars around her neck and a clipboard in her hand. Behind her, a man in a polo shirt and khakis stepped out holding what looked like an oversized folder. They both marched toward my fence like it was a battlefield. I didn't know what stunt she was pulling this time, but I had the sense it wasn't going to be subtle. Bolt stood alert beside the coupe, tail flicking, ears up. Spitfire let out a low grunt and moved to the side of the pasture, his hooves pressing into the dirt like he was ready for a repeat performance. Karen wasted no time. She hollered across the fence that she was conducting a private environmental inspection. She claimed the pasture, and the animals in it, posed a threat to her soil quality and property water runoff. She insisted she had the right to investigate as a concerned adjacent landowner. The man with her nodded silently and took out a measuring tape. I asked if they had any credentials. Karen said they didn't need any, because she was invoking her rights under rural health and safety protocols. That wasn't even a thing, and I knew it. I let her talk for a while, watching her pace back and forth with her little binoculars, occasionally pretending to jot down note. Meanwhile, the man took awkward measurements near the fence post, staying just within her side of the property. They thought they were being slick. I just stood there sipping coffee, and letting the camera mounted under the porch capture every second of it. Then she made a mistake. She reached over the fence with a metal probe and jabbed it into the soil on my side. She claimed it was for moisture calibration, whatever that meant. That was all I needed. I walked inside, printed out a copy of the restraining order filed last week after she'd tried to weld the gate, and brought it out. I held it up without saying a word. The man next to her turned pale, immediately stopped measuring, and whispered something in her ear. She tried to play it off, yelling that I was harassing her, that she was just trying to protect the community. But her voice cracked. She knew she'd pushed too far. Again. That night, I uploaded the footage to a private Reddit account and shared the whole timeline, every ridiculous twist, every fence cutting, every spitting incident. I titled it, "Karen Tried to Sue My Alpacas, Got Slammed by Karma Instead." Took off like wildfire. Within hours, the post hit the front page of r/entitled people. By morning, it was on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and even a couple of news sites. People were obsessed with Bolt and Spitfire. One user dubbed them the Fluffy Avengers. Someone made an animation of Bolt chasing Karen with a cape blowing in the wind. Spitfire's face got photoshopped onto an action movie poster. A small shop in town offered to put them on coffee mugs, and orders started rolling in. I donated every cent to the animal shelter, and it wasn't long before the story became more than just a neighborhood squabble. It became a movement. Karen, however, had no idea how big it had gotten. She was still hiding behind closed blinds and filing complaints in the dark, convinced this was all just a localized drama. That illusion shattered the day a film crew showed up with a local anchor and asked if they could interview me for a human interest piece. I said yes on one condition: The animals were included. The segment aired the following weekend. There I was on TV, standing in front of the barn, talking about livestock safety, the ridiculousness of entitled neighbors, and why alpacas are actually great security animals. The footage of Karen getting chased in slow motion was, of course, blurred for legal reasons, but everyone knew exactly who it was. Karen's house was suddenly flooded with reporters, prank gifs, and people driving by slowly to see the infamous shortcut fence. She cracked 2 days later. She stormed across the lawn screaming that I had ruined her life, that I was using wild animals to attack civilians, that I was manipulating the media for personal gain. I didn't say a word. I just opened the gate. Bolt and Spitfire stood at the edge of the field, chewing quietly. She froze. Then she turned and ran back across her lawn with the grace of a drunken duck, nearly tripping on a sprinkler head on the way. I could hear the distant laughter of someone down the block who'd witnessed the entire thing. It didn't take long after that for the final domino to fall. The HOA, once too timid to intervene, now held a special vote. Karen was officially banned from serving on any committees, participating in community decisions, or filing anonymous reports. Her name was flagged in their system. Her only remaining card had been revoked, and she was furious. She tried to threaten a civil suit, but no lawyer would take her case. Too much footage. Too many witnesses. Too many memes. Then, one morning, the sound of another moving truck echoed through the canyon. I walked outside to see Karen's SUV being loaded with boxes and luggage. Her house was up for sale. No sign, no announcement, just quietly listed online and scheduled for a private showing. Doug, her husband, looked tired. He nodded at me as he loaded a final box labeled garden tools, though from what I could see, it mostly contained half-used candles and decorative stones. Karen didn't look at me. She kept her head down, sunglasses on, Pomeranian in a purse. But karma wasn't done. As the final truck started to pull out, the driver accidentally backed too far into the very fence she had once cut. The gate gave way slightly and swung open. Bolt and Spitfire, ever watchful, walked forward like it was a red carpet moment. Karen screamed from inside the SUV. Bolt let out a long grunt and dropped a fresh pile of farewell on the gravel. Spitfire stood tall, staring her down as if to say, "This is our land now." I didn't stop them. I just leaned on the fence post and watched the last chapter of this insane saga play itself out. The truck sped off, Karen's voice trailing into the distance, and just like that, she was gone. Peace returned to the ranch in a way I hadn't felt in months. The pasture healed. The animals relaxed. The neighbors came by more often, smiling and waving, sharing stories about Karen's chaos like campfire tales. Bolt and Spitfire got their own little plaques on the barn wall for "Service Above Spit," and kids from the local school started coming out for weekend visits, learning about animals and how to respect boundaries, fence lines included. I didn't win through shouting, threats, or lawsuit. I won by standing my ground, recording everything, and letting the world see what happens when entitlement meets fluffy justice. Karen thought she could trample over country life with her city drama. But out here, we've got patience, community, and alpacas who take their job very seriously. She cut a fence thinking it would make her life easier. All it did was unleash a whirlwind of wool, spit, and consequences. And now, every time I look out at that field, I smile. Because I know that behind every peaceful ranch scene, there's a story. And sometimes that story bites back.